Welcome to A Parent's Guide to Child Development. I'm your host, Anna Marie Von Furley from Fledgling's Flight. Each podcast, we strive to give parents the tools they need to help their child thrive through conversations with experts in child development and psychology, where you can learn about the most important information that you didn't know existed. Today, we are talking with Kasha Pyka about gross motor delay. This is a really exciting topic for me, and I'm so excited to talk to you about gross motor delay. So before we dig in, I would love for you to tell our audience about yourself.
Awesome. So my name is Kasha, and I'm a pediatric physiotherapist all the way in Canada in Toronto. I have been doing this coming on 8 years now, but definitely have kind of niched myself in infant development and feeding concerns. So definitely a passion of mine and something I love chatting about all hours of the day.
Yeah, we're recording really early, so that's why that was brought up. So yeah, we're up with just like all parents are. Everybody's up this early when you've got children. No sleep for us.
Exactly.
So people may or may not have heard of gross motor or gross motor skills. So what is meant by gross motor skills?
Great question. So we're always confused, and apologies if this is not the same terminology in the States, but occupational therapists who do a lot of fine motor that deals with, as the word entails, very small movements. Gross motor is those big physical development skills. So in infancy, anything from rolling, crawling, walking, being able to move your body through those bigger movements. And that continues as the child grows until about 6 years of age. We have kind of very specific standardized gross motor skills that we're looking at to make sure that all children are developing on their own trajectory. Obviously, there's a bunch of skills that we're looking at to make sure that they're gaining, but obviously every kiddo does so on their own timeline, but we're looking at those bigger, larger movement patterns for sure.
Yeah, when I talk about it to people, I say like fine motor skills have to use the fingers of hands, and the gross motor ones are the big muscle groups that help you, walk, crawl, run, climb stairs, ride a bike, swim.
Exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of people, especially in our public system, it's definitely very standardized that way. Whereas occupational therapists or fine motor is hands and arms, and gross motor and physio is more like lower extremity and legs. But definitely in infancy, kind of goes from head to toe, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, they're all related, turns out.
They sure are.
So what is the first milestone associated with gross motor skills?
It's a great one. So, obviously, in infancy, we've got our newborn stage. So, everything has to do with the head at that point. And usually, that's all we're looking at, or primarily looking at for the first 4 months, is all movements of the head. Obviously, the biggest ones are being able to turn both ways. And as a physio, we definitely look at symmetry a lot in that age group because that's basically the only thing they can do. More so on their backs because it's easier to turn your head left and right as a newborn when you don't have gravity. But once they start doing tummy time and maybe you're supported sitting with them, we're still looking at all movements of the head in those first couple of weeks and up to about 4-ish months for sure.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I recalled from my son is like the sheer weight of that skull. I was like, holy cow,
Huge.
that is so heavy. And they
Yeah.
have no muscles, like they have no muscle development. So they have to build those muscles to be able to support that giant rock on top of
Yep.
their skeleton.
Yeah, and if anyone has their pediatrician appointments, they always measure the head and give you that percentile. And that's why, because some kids, for lack of a better word, just have a bigger noggin, and it is so much harder to move their heads. And so we do take that into account because that's the only thing they're able to move, but it's also the biggest thing that they have to move. As they get older and use their arms or trunk, things kind of even out because they have new muscles. But yeah, it is a lot of movement for an infant to be able to lift up their head, no doubt.
Yeah. So is there a particular order to gross motor skill development?
Yeah, it's definitely a top-down approach. There is some controversy in terms of certain gross motor skills, should they come before or after the other. But usually they need head control first, so they need to be able to look both ways. And then that is what kind of guides them to start rolling. So if you've ever seen a cutesy little baby on their tummy and then they just pop their head over, everything starts from their noggins. And then as they start to get better, things look a little bit more controlled, because then they start developing their tummy muscles, their core, they start sitting upright against gravity, and then everything goes down the chain. Their hip muscles, their legs, and then lastly, obviously, their feet. But we kind of look at everything top down, even when they're infants, just because if for whatever reason they were in mom's belly and they were scrunched up, they might have some asymmetries or things that we still need to look at, even if they're not using those muscles at that age.
Right. Yeah, that's, one of the things that I think of is when we talk about fledgling's flight and development, we talk about them in like cascades. And I don't know if you
Mm,
agree with this, but I always imagine it's like a row of dominoes. And then if you set one off, it next triggers the next, triggers the next.
hundred.
But if one is missing, then that cascade doesn't continue. But like, for instance, you're talking about like, well, you can't sit up unless you can hold your head up, and you can't also sit up unless you've got the core strength to be
Yeah,
able to do that. And so, and then you can't kneel or crawl unless you've got that strength too. So it makes sense that there are certain things that fall in order, that come develop in a certain order, but also sometimes they get transposed. I don't know. I mean, you were saying, you said there's a controversy. I would love to hear more about this.
well, just because you talked about the crawling and everything should come in
Yes.
order, and that is 100% how it should. Some kids for sure skip a couple of steps. I know specifically in the States, because we follow your guidelines, they took out crawling as a milestone, which in the physio community we don't love, because of the fact if they just start from going from rolling, they sit, and then all of a sudden they're in standing, they haven't gotten the coordination, they haven't gotten the core strength, then everything in this new position, they are just going to compensate. So if all of a sudden I'm placed into standing, but I don't have my tummy muscles to support myself to be able to shift my weight and catch my balance, then some kids get more off balance. Some kids start not being able to use those tummy muscles and start using different muscles to compensate. And then we kind of have to backtrack, making it harder for us as physios to explain that to parents. Because a lot of times they'll be like, well, they just skipped it, they'll be fine. And we're like, okay. However, if they don't have these dominoes, as you've said, then everything else, they're just going to find ways to figure it out, which is in itself amazing for an infant to figure out. But then it does make it harder to teach them newer things if they don't have that trajectory, or if they don't have that cascade from before, because now they're just going to use new muscles and they should have been able to use prior muscles before. So it's kind of fun to figure out what kiddos can do, what they're missing, but it definitely impacts things down the chain for sure.
Well, that's really interesting because I didn't realize that that was now a thing. Now I have a 16-year-old, so definitely they didn't. It was still crawling was a step because I do remember them saying like, don't put them on the little walker. Like, it's not the one where they're sitting inside and they're not
Yeah,
supporting their own weight, but the one where they can stand and hold and sort of like push a thing.
for
It's like,
sure.
don't let him do that because once he starts doing that, then he's not going to want to crawl, and he really needs to crawl because you need
Yeah,
the asymmetry development, right? The bilateral coordination, which is like
yep,
right hand and the upper and lower bodies. And that if they don't have that, then they'll have trouble like riding a bike and swimming and all that kind of
for
coordination
sure.
later. So I'm actually shocked. I'm shocked that
Yeah,
that's now
I
thought.
wish I had the research for you to describe why. I mean, this is more of me nerding out on things, but they haven't changed any of our developmental scales. So we still have all these scales that we follow, and we'll show parents, hey, at this age, they should be doing this or this in different positions. So it's still in all of our developmental scales, but they took it out as a primary milestone that you have to look for, which, again, me being a physio, it's not my favorite thing because, as you had mentioned, it impacts things like riding a bike, your coordination, swimming. But from our OT friends or our occupational therapists, it also impacts things like writing and crossing midline, being able to just coordinate the body in general. And it's outside of being a gross motor, it's definitely a developmental and brain capacity way to function and to learn and to do things. So it does impact quite a lot outside of just moving your body.
Well, I agree with you that that it should be something that they should be achieving. And in Fledging Slide app, we definitely have crawling as a skill that needs to be achieved. So we're not
Love
changing that.
it.
This is another maybe controversial topic. So should parents compare their child's gross to motor? Oh, let me try that again. Should parents compare their child's gross motor development to other children of their age?
Answer is yes and no. So, yes, in the sense you should be keeping an eye out. Oh, what are other kids doing at this age? Am I encouraging that type of development? Meaning, am I taking them out to the park? Am I doing things that are developing them physically? But on the opposite side, no. Because, like I had mentioned originally, there is a trajectory and there are similar to weight and height, there are percentiles that every child will fall on. So 50% of kids should be doing all the skills at the recommended timelines, but some kiddos are 25% above. Some kiddos are 25% below. So it is okay if your child isn't keeping up with their peers, but if they have constantly always just been a little bit behind, that doesn't also mean, okay, they're behind, we'll let them figure it out. It's still nice to give them supports and what we call in physio purposeful play ideas. So, giving you ideas in terms of how to engage with your child. Just because outside of their physical development, sometimes their emotional state, their regulation, their personality also puts them behind. So, they might not want to interact. And then you're like, oh, that's just how my kiddo is. But if they're also then not exposed to those things, then how are they supposed to learn to keep up with their peers? So every child does develop on their own, but they should be keeping up on their own curve. So if you've ever seen a physio and they've kind of told you they're at the 50th percentile, they're hitting everything every single time we check in, great. But it's also okay if your child is on the 25th percentile and that's how they've been continuing to climb the curve. It just means that we just need continued support to ensure that they're going to stay on that curve and continue to want to keep up with their peers. Because I think that's a big one that a lot of people miss, especially when we talk to pediatricians and family doctors. They're like, oh, they'll figure it out. But not every kid does. We all need supports, whether we're a child or an adult. So we're really big, at least at the practice that I work at, about early intervention and just giving every child the opportunity to move in their way, but also still supporting them the best we can.
Yeah. So my son, this is the sort of to your point, like we always talk about there being like a range within like a milestone
Yeah.
achievement. So the best example I can give in my own life is so my son was born 6 weeks early, but his
Mhm.
cousin was born like 6 weeks late. So there should have been like 3 months in age difference, but it turned out to be 2 weeks because he was late
Mm,
early. And
yeah.
his cousin started walking at 9 months, but my son didn't start walking until 14 and a half months. And both are normal. They're just on sort of like opposite ends, right?
Yeah.
So, and now that they're both 16, like, his cousin is very sporty and very like he can do all the sports because he came to them very early and that was really his gift. Whereas my son was more like an intellectual person, so not so
Yeah.
sporty, but was reading at 2.5 and achieved intellectual trajectory was faster, more accelerated than his cousin. So every kid's different. So
100%. And a lot of times I think as much as I love ChatGPT and Google, they all tell you what the average is and never the range. So a lot of times if your child isn't walking by 12 months, like that is the worst, they should be walking. Parents or grandparents are saying what's wrong, but there is a range. And so for every skill, there is a earlier time point and a later one, so long as they're falling within that spectrum and they're continuing to progress, that really is all that matters. And we all develop, we find our own interests later on, and not all of us want to be D1 athletes, even if our parents want us to.
right, it's true. So earlier you mentioned this, and I said I'd just circle back. You were talking about preferences or symmetry. So
Yeah.
is it okay for an infant to have a preference?
Usually we say they shouldn't have a hand dominance, a foot dominance until they're actually using their hands for feeding, for writing, if you're going into a sport. So by about 3, that tends to be okay. But before that, they shouldn't. So if we think of as a baby, if they're constantly looking one way, then they're just going to develop more of that orientation towards that side. They'll use that one side of their body, and that'll continue to pattern for them because they've been exposed to that side. It's easier, preps the brain, tells them, hey, this feels easy. I'm just going to automatically go and do that. And then going the opposite direction makes it harder. And so then when we get into higher level skills after walking, like stairs, jumping, if that patterning has continued to happen, then going up the stairs is that 1 foot pattern called step 2. So they only go up with their left, meet the right, left, right, where it should be symmetric, where they're changing. Or when they're jumping, they tend to gallop versus 2 feet going off. So all those skills before 3-ish should be fairly symmetric, because then they start getting a dominance, and then they might walk with 1 foot out more than the other. They might crawl with 1 foot propped. And then all those muscles are getting developed. They're also getting smarter, and making them do something on their opposite side is frustrating for them, frustrating for parents, frustrating for the physios to try to help families understand that they need to be doing this. So the short answer is no, they shouldn't have a preference up until around 3-ish.
I remember when my son would color, he would, if we'd open a coloring book and he'd color with his left hand on the left side page and then with his right hand on the right side of the page. And we didn't know which way he would be because my husband's left-handed and I'm right-handed. And my husband really wanted him to be left-handed, but turns out he's right-handed. So
Such a disappointment.
yeah, well, one of many. No, I'm kidding. So what does gross motor delay mean? I know we already talked about, developmental milestones happen in a range. Every kid develops at their own pace. As long as you are looking at, there's always some kind of improvement along their own curve. So
Mhm.
when do we determine that there's a delay happening?
Yeah. So if you've never seen a physio, obviously you're not going to know where your child lands on those curves. We usually say, obviously, we want them between the 25th and 50th percentile. If you're at home, you kind of Google gross motor skills and you're like, oh, yeah, maybe that one seems a little bit delayed. You want to ensure that every 2 to 4 weeks, they're either gaining something new or they're becoming better at it. So usually I'll say they might start rolling, and then within 4 weeks, they're torpedo rolling. So they're going from one end of the house to the other. They don't need to gain a new skill every 4 weeks, but so long as they're getting better at it, if nothing has changed after 6 to 8 weeks, that's when we kind of say that's when you should just get some support. Because then what happens is they're not only developing physically, but cognitively as well. So going back to saying if they had a preference one way, their brain just develops towards that side. It makes it easier, it makes it automatic. And so to go to the opposite direction, their brain, their personality is going to be like, I absolutely don't want to do that. Even though they might be able to strength wise, if you just help them, they just have developed that cognitive piece as well. And that kind of impedes on making things easier or providing exercises that could help them. So anything after about 6 to 8 weeks, we always say just get some support. We still consider it early intervention. I don't know the state of things in the States, but in Canada, definitely we hear a lot of, oh, they'll figure it out. Just give them time. Come back in 3 months, and then we'll see if things are still the way they are. We just say that's a little bit too much time. I say this to all my parents. Children are far smarter than we are. Like they might not communicate the best by screaming at us, but they really are smart. And after 3 months of doing the same thing over and over and over again, they're not going to want to all of a sudden be like, you know what, today is the day. I'm going to do it to my other side. It just doesn't work like that for them. Unless, again, parents are encouraging it. But they're just going to do what's most convenient. And I do it all the time. I I'd rather take the path of least resistance than do something a little bit harder. So anything over 6 to 8 weeks is technically where we would say get some supports. They are on track for potentially being delayed.
Yeah, like to your point, I'm actually surprised that they want to wait that long because there's only like that 1,000-day window from birth where the brain starts pruning connections that are no longer being used. And like if you're giving away 90 days
Yeah.
just to see, like that seems like a terrible thing. Like because there's that these are precious times to make those connections in the brain. And I don't think you're doing anyone any favors by not addressing it, right? So, by wasting that much
Yeah.
time.
I wonder, I mean, I just said that kids are smarter than we give them credit for, and I'm assuming maybe that's what the medical community thinks, that they'll just figure it out. They are smart, they're trying to learn their bodies. But at the same time, if it's easier, why would I want to do something harder? I see it all the time in clinic when I'm trying to get a child to roll the other way or use the opposite side of their body. They purposely resist. They're smart enough and they're going to be like, why would I do that? I've never experienced that side. Why not go to the easier side? I know that I won't fall this way. And so it isn't as easy as, oh, they'll just figure it out. Some kids do need that little bit of assistance. And at least in the practice that I'm at, where if a family comes in and truly things are going great and I can just give you tips and tricks, that is where I would love to see our profession be more preventive, give you an idea. You know what? This could turn into something, but work on these things. And if something doesn't improve in 6 weeks, come on back. Versus being like, oh, wow, they're 3 to 6 months delayed. And now I have to kind of reorient their body, reorient how they feel in space. And that'll just make our treatment planning so much longer and tedious. And sometimes at that point, costly for parents as well. So definitely we're on the side of earlier intervention and why not provide a support and get the green light that everything is okay versus being like, you know what, I think there's a lot of things we need to work on right now. So yeah, definitely would love to see that change. So hopefully this podcast will be that shining moment.
Well, that's why we're here. So that makes me think of two questions. And one is, how young are you seeing clients? I mean, what's the earliest that parents are coming to you saying, maybe we need some early intervention?
Yeah, I think two ways. One, I get them when the pediatrician has noticed something or when the parents just have this gut feeling that something just feels off. I'm looking at other kids, they're not just developing the same. So a lot of my infants come in and around 3 to 6 months. I will say I've had even younger. I've had a 7 week or 7 day old, 11 day old come in. And those are those parents that are just like, either it's their first kid, their fourth kid, who knows, and they're just like, I don't remember, or this is my first time being a parent. What am I supposed to be doing? There's so much information out there. So truly, you can come as early as you need. And again, our role is to educate, to support, as much it is to treat. But if you're coming in early, I'd just rather give you all the education and the tips and tricks rather than you going on Google or Chat GPT and finding something and going down a rabbit hole, and then all of a sudden you think that your child has some horrible condition, and actually everything is fine with them. So they can come in as early as a week. I think I had, as a funny anecdote, I have a family right now that I am seeing. Their daughter is 2. They just had their second baby. The baby was born, and then 3 days later, the mom called to book in advance. They're coming in at a 2-month-old age, but 3 days later, they're like, we're getting in physio right now. We know what to expect, we think, but we'd rather just have a check in at 2 months just to make sure that everything that we remember is correct. And also, we don't know what we don't know. You know, if they're moving correctly, and if they are, fantastic. We'll come back if we need to. But I love those types of families only because I would truly love our profession to be more preventive and educational than reactive and having to try to treat things. Even though, again, that is still my job, but I would like to see that shift a little bit more.
Yeah. So what is the most common like gross motor delay that you see in your clinic?
So, I mean, we talked about how crawling isn't a gross motor skill anymore. I would say that's number one. And then number two is walking. For whatever reason, those are the skills that families just latch onto. They're watching other kids crawl around in a mommy group or in a parent class, or they happen to have family friends that come by and the kid that is a couple weeks older than them is already walking. So I would say those are the big ones that families come in for the most because they're just watching other kids. And like we talked about, we don't want to do comparisons, but those are the main ones. I think that they're the most mobile at those times. And so most families are like, oh, yeah, my kid isn't crawling and they're 10 months or 12 months or whatnot. And so that's kind of just like a light bulb moment for them.
Interesting. So what does physio look like for an infant?
Oh, my favorite question. It is really just playing. Uh, it is funny. We've had this chat in our clinic recently where a lot of parents just assume that our gym space is a playground because it really just looks like we're playing. We're on the floor, we are dangling toys, we're making funny faces, but there is a method to our madness. So when a little one comes in, irrespective of age between infancy and a year, we're putting them in different positions, their tummy, their back, in sitting, standing, kneeling, if it's age appropriate. And we're looking at how they're moving their bodies top down. We're seeing if they can use both sides. We're also just seeing how they engage. Are they interested? Do they just show a lack of interest to one side? So we are looking at everything always, even though it looks like we're just dangling toys and making silly faces. Um, and then a lot of times it is observing. So it is just watching what a child does. It's a new space, a new environment. So sometimes they're not willing to do anything. And so we have to chat with the parents. Whereas on the flip side, sometimes they're all over the place and parents are like, this has never happened before. So it's a lot of observation and just seeing how they move their bodies, how things are connected. Is everything working in unison? Or are certain movements very one sided? Are they engaging with their environments as well? So outside of the physical, we do look at personality. We look at how they want to interact. Do they show any sort of interest? And even though we can't change kiddos' personalities, we can still change families' behaviors. So if you're just used to placing your child on their tummy or their back, because you assume your doctor said they'll figure it out, we'll give parents ways to interact with their kiddo more, make sitting with them on their lap actually an exercise, make diaper changes an exercise. So outside of observing, it's also just listening to the parents quite a bit, educating them, and really just seeing what their concerns are, how do they interact, and giving them as much knowledge as possible to ensure that they feel as comfortable handling their little one and understanding their development as well.
Yeah, it's one of those things, man. Nobody goes to college to have a baby.
Yes.
Everybody just makes it up as they go along.
Yeah, and I have a lot of friends right now that are constantly sending me text messages. I'm like, what is my baby doing? And I'm like, well, I I couldn't tell you because I didn't learn this also in school, but you see so many kids and everyone is so different. But a parent who didn't go to school for this, they have no idea what's going on. They're going off of TikTok and Instagram and their friends and going, I've had a lot of people using Chat GPT recently and putting in info about their child and it's spewing out all this stuff. And I'm like, whoa. I mean, it's cool to hear some of the information is accurate, but nobody really knows until you see a kiddo playing and moving to really understand what they're doing.
Yeah, we messed around with ChatGPT on child development and stuff before, and it's not always accurate. So I would never be relying on ChatGPT to tell me anything about my child's development because I know a fair amount about this stuff. Like we were like, oh, like let's ask it about certain milestones, whatever. And like, sometimes it's wildly off. Like, this is an exaggeration, but like, no, your 6-month-old should not be eating a cheeseburger. And that is not what it said, but it was
Yes.
comparatively the same thing. But the whole point of this podcast is I feel like all the best information is stuck in the heads of experts like you. And it's my job to like pull all that information out and then give it to parents so that they're actually getting accurate information from experts and not from a mommy blogger or like a mom influencer on the socials. So
For sure. And I mean, there is a role that social media plays. I mean, we use Google reviews a ton because parents want to know other parents' experience. And I'm not saying that that's not true. You shouldn't be looking at that. I think it's a piece of the puzzle. But every child is just so different. So whatever you put into Chat GPT, it's going to give you an algorithm of the averages, and it'll give you things to look out for. But a lot of parents also get freaked out if they read one thing that might just even say on Chat GPT that, you know, there is a potential that they could be delayed because of this or that, then it automatically freaks families out. And they, even if they ask questions back, it's not giving them that empathetic response that maybe they're looking for, or that personal interaction. So it can cause a little bit of stress as well, for sure.
Yeah. So when would you recommend a parent see a pediatric physio?
I think there's definitely two worlds where this exists. One, if you're just curious, I have no idea what my child should be doing, whether it's your first, fourth, second, and you just want to do what we call a baby check in. Kind of like you go to your pediatrician or your doctor every few months to check in on all the things on the list. The same thing can be done at a physio to just check in on those physical milestones. And then, like I said, if your child, again, we're talking more infancy, has not really progressed or hasn't shown any more interest in doing new things or more frequently, after about 6 to 8 weeks, I would say just pop on in. It's easier to start earlier and to get an idea if there's anything you need to work on versus coming in a little bit later. We're still able to help. It just might take a little bit longer, or we might be battling some behaviors or tendencies that we'll need to fix along the way. So the earlier, the better is my answer for this one.
Yeah, that's interesting because at least in the States, the doctors spend like maybe 10 minutes doing like a wellness check. And they're just not going to catch everything because they're looking for specific things, like oftentimes that they're not catching like primitive reflexes that should have integrated because they don't have the time to test for those. And those can have like lifelong effects if those don't get integrated. And so that's so smart to have so preemptively go ahead, even without like a referral, and make an appointment with a physio so that they can do their own assessment. That's not 5 minutes. That's like more
Yeah.
in depth because I don't know that general practitioners really go to school and know the kinds of things that you know. Like they know certain things that they should be checking for, but that's really it. Like they're looking for growth trajectories and weight and no fevers and vaccinations and whatnot. And a
Exactly.
little bit of everything else, but they don't have the time to really spend to do a proper assessment.
100%. And they went to school for the whole body in terms of the systems. We went to school for the physical development. We have chiropractors who went to school for alignment. Like we all have a role in a child's development, but they aren't the end all be all. And I think, again, maybe I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here, but I think a lot of people just go to their doctor because that's the first person, the primary person that they get to see. And that'll be someone that they can easily ask questions to. But yeah, in 10 minutes, you're not going to get everything out. They're also not going to get to see much. I mean, I know there are so many babies that come in, and the first 20 minutes, they're just staring me down. They don't want to talk to me. They don't want to babble. They don't want to interact with me whatsoever. And so, if they're bringing them into the doctor, and in 10 minutes, the doctor has just seen them sit, then they're not getting a good enough picture in terms of what's going on. So, definitely, we all have our own roles. And I don't pretend to know anything about the medical system. I'll tell parents if they ask me about weight or feeding and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, not my scope of practice. Ask your doctor, ask a speech language pathologist. That is just not my realm. And I'd rather they get the information from somebody who has studied it or is an expert in it versus just getting a quick fire response from me who had might have heard something from a mom or a parent. So yeah, it's a very interesting world when it comes to development for babies.
So what's a good cadence for families to for preventive. I know it would be different if there is something that you're doing therapy for, but just for preventive, just a check-in assessment, like how regularly should parents bring in their kid?
Yeah, so it'll definitely depend on when they come in. We'll do a full assessment and we'll give a more typical recommendation. But if you're just coming in for purposeful play ideas, usually every 4 to 6 weeks. It does not have to be more than that, especially if we are just giving you ideas in terms of how to interact, when to start certain positions. It gives them 6 weeks to work on these things. And if we notice any asymmetries or delays, then we can see that by their next appointment. Or they'll let us know that they've noticed this at home. They've tried a bunch of things. So every 4 to 6 weeks seems pretty accurate.
Amazing. Well, this has been such an interesting conversation and
Yeah.
controversial. So how can people get in touch with you?
Amazing. So obviously, I am in Canada, unfortunately, for all of the US families. However, I do have a professional Instagram account called Motor Milestone Physio. I have a lot of content on there. I'm more than happy to provide some input on things. I also do know, I believe Starfish Therapies is out in California, but I could be wrong. If the owner is listening into this, then she can correct me. But I used to do some mentorship with them during COVID, and I'm pretty sure they have a bunch of centers out in California. So that could be of help. But if anyone's just curious about just infant development, I'm always willing to chat. And if there's anything more specific about your child, I will always say it's just easier to go see somebody and give them guidance in terms of reaching out to their own local pediatric physio.
But if people have questions, they could DM you on Instagram, right?
100%. Yeah, I have my clients sometimes will ask me questions or other families. I will say I might have gotten one around the world, which makes me feel very international. But it is nice to have social media. Like I said, it is a world that we can all interact on, and why not use it to our benefits?
It's true. So we have more information about Keisha's bio will be in the caption, as well as a link to where you can get a hold of her. And thank you so much for your time today. This was a great conversation, and we should have you
Anne
back.
Marie. Thank you. I'm excited to chat with you guys on Instagram now.
All right, talk to you later.